A good afternoon and welcome to this live broadcast. Now, every 10th of December is the International Human Rights Day, but a day before then, the human rights defenders get to be celebrated and discussed on the role that they play in human rights defense. Now, of course, it needs no reminding that the Chapter 4 Constitution of Uganda enshrines human rights at the heart and how people wish to be governed. And I have with me today a very exquisite panel of the most elite, I should say, the best in the human rights defense space to discuss this. But let's first introduce ourselves to our viewers, starting with you, Hassan.
Good afternoon, Raymond, and good afternoon, viewers. My name is Hassan Shire. I think the longest serving human rights defender in this continent up to now. So I'm the executive director of Defend Defenders and also chairperson of the Pan-African Human Rights Defenders Network. Both networks, they have their headquarters in Kampala, where we consider a hub city where human rights defenders who find a challenge gather together, heal, rest, respite, train, recuperate, and go back to Sudan, to South Sudan, to Kenya, to Tanzania, to Somalia, to Eritrea, to Ethiopia, whenever situations where they left have calmed down.
Subsidized.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we are here with 47 staff and located our headquarters here, even though we have branches in the other part of Africa.
All right, thank you so much. Brenda.
Yes, good afternoon, Raymond, and I'm glad to be here. And really, as the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda, we are proud to be part of this panel. Brenda Kugonza, and I work as the Executive Director of the Women Human Rights Defenders Network Uganda. It's a nationwide organization, and it's a membership organization.
All right, thank you so much. Richard?
Thank you, Robert.
Robert, I mean, Chirenga, yes.
My name is Robert Chirenga, and I am the Executive Director of the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders. And it's a registered NGO that brings together over 148 organizations comprised of individuals and organizations whose work is basically to protect and promote human rights using non-violence.
Thank you so much also for coming, Robert. I want to start with you, Hassan. Today we want to talk really about rights at the center of the COVID-19 response, if there's any to start with. But let's discuss how have rights been trampled upon during the response to the COVID-19 itself as a pandemic?
Thank you so much, Raymond. Before I answer your question, if you allow me, I want to frame the symbolic nature of this week,
Yes.
which is going on, and beyond the 16 days of activism campaigning against violence against women, which culminates also on the 10th December. But this week, starting Monday and up to Friday, we have brought together with the National Coalition for Human Rights Defenders, over 100 of human rights defenders and donors and the UN agencies, simply because there are three main events within. The first one is Anti-Corruption Day, which is on the 8th of December. The second one is now celebrating today, on 9th, the tremendous value and the work done by the human rights defenders, which again coincides when the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders has been adopted 22 years back in New York by all member states, including Uganda. And that's a framework within which human rights defenders who are sitting here and the coalitions work with. And then International Human Rights Day, which again on the 10th culminates on that, whereby we celebrate the promise of never again, whereby each and every individual, because of simply he or she is human, have inalienable and universal rights to enjoy. So when I come to your question, the trembling, you see, our focus all the time was duty bearers or the state parties. They have responsibility to protect the human rights of their people. And this now mass killing of what you call it COVID-19 is a war. It declared it's invisible virus, which have declared on us war with no borders. It comes with planes, it comes with ships, it comes with no borders. So the state have to stand up and put reasonable, temporary, measurable regulations, which have a time bound set to that, but not renegade the other basic rights of people. Right to live can be protected without trampling on freedom of expression, assembly, and association. And that only comes when citizenry of any given society participates the building of that piece of pizza. How you want to protect me? Let me talk. Let me have a stake. Let me say also things. You know that now. When you look everywhere, societies they are not with conformity in everywhere, rich and poor countries, in the United States, in Brazil, in India. When you see what's happening, you may appreciate in Uganda we have more discipline in observing the guidelines of the Ministry of Health. Yeah, so we always look at that, the right perspective, and advise our members to obey the law, to obey the regulations, because you cannot put the risk of thousands of people by you are not observing the things. So that's what proportionality has to be maintained.
All right, thank you so much. I want to bring you in, Brenda. When we talk about rights, of course, for women, it's a different conversation. We already have a parity in access to almost everything, from the economy all the way down to the wages earned by people. There's a parity. So in the application of states applying themselves to solving this COVID-19 pandemic, how have the rights of women been trampled upon?
Yes. Thank you so much, Raymond, for that very key question. And allow me, first of all, re-echo what Hassan has said, that we are having this discussion in the framework of the 16 Days of Activism campaign to end gender-based violence. And also, I want the public out there to get to understand that 29th November is a day for women human rights defenders, which is always forgotten at times. So for us, we are privileged to bring this out. One, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic sidelined women's rights. And for us, that was really something to cause alarm. I am telling you, COVID-19 came with restrictive measures. So women human rights defender, by the way, these are women who are promoting rights of women and girls. These are women who are promoting all rights. These are women who also provide, they served as a backbone to the government of Uganda during the COVID-19. But because of the following restrictions, women human rights defenders were unable to continue promoting the rights of women and girls. You will remember that during the first, when we had discussions, the different authorities had discussions around lockdown measures. One of the statements that came from the policymakers was, let us first put aside gender-based violence cases. You will report gender-based violence cases after lifting the lockdown measures. Now that meant that the survivors of gender-based violence who already were confined because of quarantine, staying at home, you're staying with abusive people who are abusing you, and you could not even go to police because they had even told the victims, the survivors of GBV, not to go to police. But you remember initially during the lockdown that there was also partial lockdown of courts. So court officials were told to, first of all, stay at home. That meant suspending hearings. And so it was very difficult for women human rights defenders to report abuses and violations against women and girls. And so the other thing is we saw the exclusion of women on the National Task Force. So women were underrepresented. So if women were actually represented on the National Task Force, we would actually come up to contribute alternatives on how to respond to the pandemic using a rights-based approach. But unfortunately, we were not recognized. And that is why you saw so many women who are suffering, pregnant women suffered because of the transportation bans. So women were unable to go for antenatal services because of the lockdown measures. And for us as women human rights defenders, that impacted on us in terms of emotional well-being. We were stressed. We didn't know how to support these marginalized women. And that is how the pandemic treated us.
Robert, she mentioned something important about a rights-based approach to responding to the pandemic. How exactly does that look like?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mujuni. A rights-based approach in terms of development planning is a framework where you integrate human rights principles and norms in all planning processes. And the aim here is to ensure that while you are carrying out development or carrying out any interventions, you do not violate or abuse human rights, but you rather promote them. And then in a rights-based approach, it creates two individual characters: duty bearers, the state, that's the ministries, departments, and agencies of government, and then the rights holders. So duty bearers are supposed to ensure that they respect protect and fulfill human rights, even during this COVID pandemic. And then it's the right holders who should hold the duty bearers accountable. I'll give you an example. When we talk about respecting human rights, even within this COVID, we are saying that the state shall not interfere with the enjoyment of your rights. Yes, it can restrict your rights, because human rights are not absolute. They can be restricted. So when you restrict on my rights to movement, and I tell you I'm a market vendor, I go to sell vegetables in the market. These vegetables, I buy them from farmers who have just brought them to the market. What are you providing for me now that you've said you will not move to the market? Is there a mechanism? Two, you must be able to do a mapping. The levels, income levels of Mr. Mujuni and Robert are not the same. So there is a degree of vulnerability. So you must be, who are the most vulnerable in this society of ours? So any interventions for COVID, to fight COVID, must start with the most vulnerable. If you are going to give even food, you don't start giving food to someone employed. You start with the unemployed, because he has no source of income. The employed one has, and that's what a rights-based approach is, that in all intervention, you must give priority to the vulnerable. And of course, there are others like participation. To what extent are these interventions by government inclusive of all actors? And when I talk of all actors, I'm talking civil society, state actors, whether church or religious groups, all these interest groups, have they been consulted? How are you dealing with vulnerable groups like people with disabilities, women, children, orphans? Are they at the same level? No, they may require special intervention, and therefore you give them priority. Then there comes the question of accountability. Are duty bearers accountable? We saw hundreds and hundreds of people move to the office of the Prime Minister, giving donations, giving vehicles, giving. Where are we seeing the response? Are these goods and services being seen by the people? Are the duty bearers accountable to say, oh, we received 100,000 bags of rice or posho, and we started distributing. How did we distribute? We started with the most vulnerable, but some missed out. Then, of course, there is the non-discrimination. That when you are using a rights-based approach, everybody should be treated equal. And of course, there is the respect for the rule of law. You saw how people were beaten. The instructions and the guidelines, the presidential guidelines, were misinterpreted. We are yet to see those perpetrators being. And so the rule of law must be respected. And of course, as I indicated, is the empowerment. We are in COVID. We've got to work together to fight it, because we are all this, as the phrase or the common phrase says, that we are in this thing together. To what extent are you empowering people to come out of this? Right now, our medical facilities, I think, are overstretched. How do you empower the citizen to avoid, besides telling me to always have a mask on, observe social distancing, are you providing me any food supplements to ensure that my immune system is boosted and therefore I don't expose myself? Do you think everybody can afford a mask? Have we all tried to provide masks, especially to the most vulnerable? The most vulnerable here are the poorest of the poor, that even to get a meal of the day is a challenge. That's the target group that you should be focusing on first before you go to do anything. And that's what a rights-based approach to development planning calls for.
Hassan, those are very important points that Robert has raised. And I wanted you to just weigh in terms of creating duty bearers who should protect the rights and rights holders and the interaction that they've had during the pandemic. How can the people who have the duty to protect these rights, how can they be held accountable for what happened during the lockdown? Exactly,
and exactly we are talking about now the work of frontline human rights defenders. That's why they have been seen controversial. That's why they have been seen that sometimes they are bringing voices which the duty bearers may not be willing to listen. Activists on the front line with these communities are the people who bring those issues and speak truth to a power, telling them these are the issues. Now, as Robert now and my sister Brenda were articulating in Uganda. And often that has not been seen in a good way. Human rights defenders, they emerge out of nowhere the same market he discussed it, you may find a woman who stands up and fights for the rights of these vendors to have their freedom to sell their things safely and securely. And the state have to provide for that, because majority of the people, they are hand to mouth. So if I miss today a work, tomorrow I may not get anything to eat. So there must be some sort of regulation, and also, as Robert said, that must be measures have to be put and right-based approach on that. What I see is that dialogue itself, that chain of protection, activists is starting together with the mandated National Human Rights Commission, together with women's groups, together with other pastoral organizations and the government and religious leaders and others. They can create a sort of harmony and dialogue to make, to point, to plan together to how to fight this enemy. And this enemy is real. That's what I want to emphasize, that. It's real, it's here, it's great now, the level 4, which means you never know, you cannot contact a trace, you never know where it happens here. But that will never take away from our cherished basic freedom as provided by your Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other instruments which forms the body of the international human rights systems. Not to be tortured. We don't want our mothers to be killed and beaten. We don't want to see that, you know, women with a small child to be just detained for 14 days and all that. So all humane way of enforcing the rules and regulations. And I agree also, you know, sometimes people can take the directive of suppose of the president or to a level where it has not even been articulated by the Minister of Health, and then interpret the way they want. And then you may see the authorities say that, but who told you that to do this? Yeah. So we must also have that check and balance of the police, of the law enforcement agencies. Yeah.
Brenda, I want to bring you in now on the role of institutions in the protection of human rights. Some of the institutions that have interacted a lot more with rights holders have been security institutions. And one profound one was the Uganda police. They released a report in between April and May. The number of gender-based violence cases, I think, had gone almost 680 during a 3-month period, which is a tremendous hike. What is the role of institutions, and how do human rights defenders interact with these institutions in the protection of rights?
All right. Thank you so much. I want to really also emphasize what my colleague has mentioned, Robert. Police and also police institutions are duty bearers. And it is the role of the state and its institutions, and it is their obligation to provide protection. The police is guided by so many legislation laws in our country. The number one instrument that the police has to implement is the Constitution, the 1995 Constitution. So having said that, I think the police have all the laws at their disposal to allow them respect human rights, even when they are trying to keep law and order. Keeping law and order does not mean using violence. And that is why, because the government of Uganda needed to guide the police in doing their work, they came up with what we call the Anti-Torture Act. That is also to curtail them from using violence to control, to create law and order. So having said that, like you said, yes, we are glad that at some point, because again, the work of women human rights defenders was very instrumental during the COVID. Women human rights defenders became whistleblowers. They raised the awareness of the suffering of women and girls. They told the police, look, women are being beaten, domestic violence, girls are being defiled, child marriage is going on, what are you doing? We are very glad that the police had the women human rights defenders, and hence during that short period of COVID-19, that's how they came up with that report. Now, what is the role of the police? The role of the police, if you look at the Domestic Violence Act of 2010, it actually tells the police what they should do in terms of addressing GBV cases. But during the COVID-19, we saw the police officers not using the Domestic Violence Act. So that means GBV was not an issue, or women's rights were not issues. What we saw during that time, it was about the pandemic. It was a public health issue, whereby we saw everyone was calling upon measures to carry out resource mobilization to address the pandemic, but not to address the plight of women and girls who are suffering domestic violence. So for me, I think the role of the police, one, we need the government to ensure that those laws are implemented, like the Domestic Violence Act, for example, the Anti-Torture Act. How? Government should invest in implementation of these laws, because also the police officers said, okay, even when now we have had the president said that now it is okay for GBV cases to come to police during COVID, but they didn't have transport to go and investigate. So for us, we are saying investment is key in terms of resource allocation, but also training. I am telling you, we are living in a patriarchal society. Now, patriarchy is a social system that promotes male dominance and female subordination. So we forget that also these police officers have come through the same system. So when they come to these institutions, if they are even trying to apply any laws, they are also coming with that mindset. So it is very important, Uganda Human Rights Commission, Ministry of Gender, to also do training for these police officers in terms of understanding human rights, women's rights, but also to give them the knowledge and the skills, because people don't have the skills to handle GBV cases. And that is how we will see the police officers become effective in responding to GBV cases, and thus promoting equality between men and women.
Robert, I want you to also respond very briefly to that one on the role of institutions in the protections of rights.
Institutions play a very key role, Mr. Mujuna has indicated, and we have very good institutions. The framework is there, the regime, the legal regime. We have first and foremost the National Human Rights Institution, called the Uganda Human Rights Commission. But currently now you would call it a dead institution. Why? The law, and that's the constitution that establishes it, clearly states that there shall be, shall is mandatory, a commission composed of a chairperson and 3 or 4 other commissions appointed by the president. What's the interpretation of that provision? That where there is no chairperson, there is no institution. So the institution that is supposed to be the watchdog, a state institution, to protect and promote human rights, doesn't exist. Legally, it doesn't. Physically, you see a structure, you see a few commissioners, but any decision they can make right now can be challenged in any courts of law as not a decision of the commission. So the issue is, can the executive appoint a substantive chair? That's number one. 2, institutions do not operate in a vacuum. You have the Uganda Police Force. It has all these policies, the human rights policy. We've now got the Human Rights Enforcement Act. We've got the anti-torture law. But these laws, and that's why before a law is passed, there is this certificate that must pass, the economic thing, the financial implication certificate. Now, when you pass a law, it means you have tested it, that there will be resources to ensure that this law is passed. Now, if the police is not well resourced, you have a structure, but it's idle. So institutions are there, but what we need to do is to resource them. In other words, are we having our priorities right, or they're upside down? To address these issues under this COVID pandemic, and more especially targeting the most vulnerable, the women, the people with the disabilities, the children, and those orphans. So institutions are there, but they need to be strengthened and supported.
I know that we're about to take a break, but Robert, if you could answer something before we take the break. We speak like our government is not hamstrung. They don't have money, and they've communicated this through the Ministry of Finance. We don't have money to implement, for example, even basic food supplies to the most vulnerable. They've run out of money to do that.
They've run out of money.
In cases where the state is unable to execute its mandate, what must happen for the protection of rights in that case?
That's a very good question, but also debatable. And that's why when you said of a human rights-based approach to development planning, one of the principles is accountability. If you don't have money, tell us that little you have, how are you allocating it? First tell us the little you have, the little you've collected in the public purse, in the treasury, including the loans you've secured to fight COVID. Just be transparent enough and tell us, this is how we've allocated these resources, and therefore we have a challenge here. And by the way, even if they had a challenge, they have the right to technical assistance, to development assistance. States have that right under the UN Charter, that you can always appeal. But the first thing we want to know, this little, the little you've collected, what URA has collected, whether it has met the targets or not met it, how have you allocated it? That will give us a clear picture to appreciate that we are in this, and therefore we really need to understand the dilemma that government is in and work with it. And that's why the principle of accountability in a rights-based approach to development planning is key.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to take a very short break, but when we return, we continue the conversation on what's the role of human rights defenders, but also celebrate the rights defenders on this, the day that the rights defenders are celebrated. Thank you so much for staying with us. We're still celebrating human rights defenders today, but also discussing the role that states are playing in particularly implementing of their own mandates during the COVID-19 pandemic and how the respect of human rights is happening during that period. And I want to let's start with the challenges. What challenges have been faced by rights defenders during this COVID-19 pandemic period?
Yeah, and beyond, actually. Thank you. First of all, we want to frame it, the role of human rights defenders and the struggle to make their work recognized by the global community. Over 20 years, organizations like Amnesty International and other international human rights institutions, they were campaigning the world community to acknowledge in some way the tremendous value and the work of human rights defenders. And due to and through negotiations in New York and in Geneva, in 1998, on the 9th December, finally, we had a document called Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. That articulates every article which allows human rights defenders to work without hindrance, try to raise funding, freedom of association, assembly, association, and also freedom to raise the bar of human rights entitlement. Because they're controversial, as I told you, because simply they speak in a futuristic way at times and brings new norms where societies may not be comfortable in dealing with that particular time. But after 10 years, 20 years, it can be a normal. That's why you see them most of the time, they are being harassed, stigmatized, and just. And then mechanism was established by the Secretary General at that particular time, appointing his own representative to propagate the guidelines throughout the world and report thereto any violations, either thematically or individual human rights defenders who have been violated, to the then Human Rights Commission and also the General Assembly. So Hina Jilani was appointed a Pakistani prominent lawyer who set actually the framework for this mandate, whereby you may recall later our own Madame Margaret Sakaja, after 6 years she took over, and then there was a French gentleman, also a good friend of us, Michael, also took over, and now Irish human rights defender, the founder of a very prominent frontline human rights defenders, who is a mother of human rights defenders actually, is now the mandate holder as of a couple of months back. So that's the evolution the mandate has passed. So that work itself, which has been legitimized by the UN, now we are calling, and Robert can speak to, because we are spearheading together, but he's taking the lead, of law, now not declaration, protecting the rights of human rights defenders in each and every country. So we have a model law where in our own continent, Ivory Coast was the first country. The same way, the human rights institution has been mandated by the parliament. We are asking each and every parliament in the continent also to recognize that work and give legitimacy to the human rights defenders in the continent. So in Uganda, that effort now is underway. I will leave to Robert there's a MB who took a leave and who tabled the bill in the Ugandan parliament, in many other places, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Ivory Coast, and in Central Africa, country like DRC. Human rights defenders now are agitating to make their work to be recognized by the law. So, and COVID-19 now, when it comes, usually human rights activists of 6 categories they were already at risk. And now on top of that, you find what you call it, under the COVID again, you are working under restrictions. So now if now South Sudanese human rights defender gets challenged, now it's a very difficult at times to immediately transfer him to a safer country. Similarly, in the entire continent, because sometimes air corridors were closed, even though now there are some opening, but restrictions are too much, because you have to test, you have to do this, you have to do that, so crossing borders are not easy, and sometimes crossing even regions. So that's the circumstance. Activists, who you will see one of the reports, work under the resource extractive industries in the continent, because we work continental level.
Yes.
They are at risk. Spur of, commercial quantities of oil and gas and other minerals have been now rediscovered in Africa. So there's a rush to that, oil rush, gas rush, these things. So people who were protecting the rights of indigenous communities and others who were on the ground are being seen as a saboteur or the anti-development. They are being stigmatized, but they are bringing legitimate voices of the communities they are part of. So they need to be also listened and be part, as Robert said, to be part of the conversation. Then you have human rights defenders working in a situation of armed conflict, those who are now in conflict situations where state and non-state actors are active to harm human rights defenders. Countries like a very child in Somalia, I'm afraid to say that now Ethiopia, war have started now, Eritrea and Burundi, in this sub-region, we can team up a good number of people, countries, which are now at variance challenge.
Yeah.
Then you talk about activists who are investigating high-level corruption and also campaigning end of impunity. They are also at greater risk than any other groups. Then you have a SOGI groups who, because of their very nature of their work and who they are, most of the societies in the continent are not willing to recognize them as a legitimate activist. Then women human rights defenders who themselves in some situations even cannot go to the court to represent their client. In Sudan, before this revolution took place, it was like that. And so forth. Now the final group is those who monitor elections, particularly before, during and after elections. Now the media group, media houses, you see how challenging it is to hold forth, to inform your communities, simply because you are caught up into what? Conflict of not making. But for you are looking at news, and then the conflict is raging. So you are prone to be injured, your equipment to be damaged, in some situations confiscated. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So it becomes a hazard of work. So those are the groups now we look out in the entire continent and try to intervene to make them relief.
Brenda, do you have any particular hazards, challenges that are particular to women's rights defenders that Hassan hasn't mentioned, perhaps?
Yeah. I think for all of us to understand this, we need to first of all understand the definition of women human rights defenders. Because sometimes there is a thinking that women human rights defenders only refers to women who are specifically promoting the rights of women and girls. Women human rights defenders are women at the forefront who are involved in all kinds of human rights work, whether they are into environmental environmental rights, land rights, gender-based violence, rights of disability people, they are into anti-corruption campaigns, battling with oil and extractive projects, name it. However, why are we focusing on women human rights defenders? We are saying these people attract hostility because of the work they do, which is human rights defense, but also because of their gender, because they are merely women. So I agree with Hassan that as women human rights defenders, we all face same challenges just like our male counterparts. But in addition, we are exposed to gender-based violence and gender-specific attacks. Raymond, allow me to share this with people, because we might not understand our challenges. Women human rights defenders for a long time have been involved in human rights battles. They have been involved in advocacy for implementation of, enactment of laws like the Female Genital Mutilation Act, Domestic Violence Act in Uganda, GBV, mobilizing communities to save our environment. They are into promoting rights of marginalized communities. However, women human rights defenders' work has received criminalized. Our work has been criminalized. We face smear campaigns. criminalization of our work. I will tell you, you have even heard here in Uganda, women human rights defenders who are promoting the rights of inheritance have been attacked as people who are going to disrupt public order. Women human rights defenders who are promoting rights in marriage, when they were pushing for the marriage and divorce bill, they were regarded as bad mothers, spoiled women, promoting Western values. And what we saw, I remember in one of the communities, rumors circulated that this woman who is promoting advocacy for the marriage and divorce bill, the husband no longer controls her. And what happened? The husband started using domestic violence for her to stop her work. And now the family members and the children pressured her to abandon her work. The other thing is we are living in a patriarchal society where social standards define appropriate and inappropriate behavior for a woman like me in public space. I am telling you, Raymond, it is okay for Hassan and Robert to speak about human rights. They will clap for them. But when it comes to a woman like me or any other women human rights defenders, you're too loud. How can your man manage you? Tone down a bit. You're bringing shame to your husband. You're also bringing shame to your family. I'm going to give you an example of one of our human rights defender, who is involved in female genital mutilation campaign in one of the communities that I will not mention. This woman has had to abandon her work because they are nicknaming her private part. You can imagine. When she goes to the trading center, everyone is calling her private part because of the work she's doing. And now it has even reached to the children in schools. Now the children stopped going to school. They said, Mommy, we think you cannot be a leader here, but also we don't want to go to school because they are telling us this is your name. She has left the community. During COVID-19, one of the female journalists in Masindi went and found out that the health centers didn't have the key requisites to protect them from COVID. These were health workers. For example, they didn't have gloves, sanitizers, and all that. And the district was busy saying that they are already equipped to handle cases of COVID. So when our own female journalists tried to raise that through their very accurate news, she was summoned by the RDC. And then also we have seen women where they will tell me, you know, you are mobilizing these women to demand for fair compensation in the oil and extractive companies in Albertine region. Then you see rumors of people saying these women are gathering you to get money on your behalf. Then you see community women members who are getting information from the women human rights defenders about how they can negotiate for fair compensation. They are now not coming to their spaces because of criminalization of their work. But what is very important here, Raymond, is that because the patriarchy promotes male dominance and female subordination, it also justifies violence against us. Like violence against women human rights defenders or women generally is normal. It's okay to discipline a woman. It's okay to face this. So now our violations as women human rights defenders are rendered insignificant or invisible because of the gendered patriarchal norms, whereby it is okay for a woman to suffer violence. And because of that, our voices are silenced. Our contributions to development and society are marginalized. And that is why we continue facing challenges in our work on a daily basis. Raymond, you have heard where they are calling. We are seeing women dying. We are seeing the cases of girls defied. Where are women activists? Women activists are also tired. Because of this use of social norms, you are not an ideal woman, you are embarrassing us. Sometimes they are shying away from their good activism work because they want to also appeal to what society expects of them. So those are the challenges that we are facing.
Robert, thank you so much for that. Robert, one of the other challenges, and this one's been spoken mostly, is the mandate. Where do defenders derive their mandate? And it's something that you've been working on, like Hassan said.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Actually, it's a question of ignorance. If you look at the Constitution, Article 38, it's very clear. It imposes on us a duty that human rights defenders, or citizens, it calls us citizens, the language it uses is citizen, have a right to participate in the affairs of governance through either their civic organizations or through their representatives. so as to influence policy within government. So it's a duty. So when you see human rights defense, and then we have other laws that regulate the way we try to influence decision in government through the NGO Act, that we are required to register ourselves. But even without register, as an individual, as Mujuni Raymond, you have the right to participate in the affairs of government by saying, look, this policy doesn't work. It's not working. Here is an alternative. Do this, intervene. So that is a right that is given to you and a duty imposed on you by the Constitution. So I would say that a majority of our state actors and non-state actors have no understanding of the provision of that Article 38. And that's why one of the human rights defenders is taking the state, the Constitutional Court, for failure to create awareness, educate the citizens about the provisions of the Constitution. You find RDCs mixing the work of human rights defenders with political actors. That you have no right to criticize the government or to provide alternatives, but rather, as NGOs, provide emergency assistance in this COVID, provide relief food. Yes, there are some NGOs that focus on that, especially those dealing with the right to food and dealing with livelihoods, but there are those who are dealing with critical governance issues in terms of participation, civil liberties. When you see someone has been detained beyond 48-hour rule, goes in the cells 10 days, beyond days, and nobody comes out, and human rights defenders come out to speak about these things, corruption and its effect on service delivery, which service delivery is actually about the rights of citizens, then people feel that we are trying to step on, going beyond what we are not supposed to. But the Constitution clearly gives us that mandate to protect and promote human rights through the work that we do. And secondly, the UN resident coordinator, whom we hosted yesterday, the distinguished Rosa Malango, is on record of saying Uganda is among the 9 countries within the world whose economy has been growing during this COVID pandemic. And the contribution of NGOs, or civil society organizations, to this economy is enormous. The checks that we sign in terms of pay as you earn deducted, the Social Security Fund, contribution, all that is money that we contribute to the coffers of the state. And therefore, our role is not only just coming out as we are called noisemakers. We are trying to provide alternatives where we think that government could have done this to ensure we are effective and efficient as a nation.
Very good.
All right, thank you so much, Robert. I want us now to spend the last minute talking about the reports. You've just launched 2 reports. One of them is Open the Doors. What is the content of this report?
Yeah, Open the Doors is first of all appreciative of the open door policy of the Ugandan government. Uganda is the largest host country when it comes to second host country when it comes to refugees. Human rights defenders, by very nature of their work, when they come here, they have to register as a refugee. So we researched the human rights defenders, their right to movement in and outside the country. So there's elaborate recommendations how to, by first of all acknowledging the liberal laws of Uganda and the reception they receive, but also now we are saying these are conscious peers, people who want to go, travel, cross-regional fertilization of ideas, share and learn, so that they still grow. But when you confine them into one place and they don't have a right to movement, to travel, to attend seminars, to do the other things, the entire thinking they had and the person they have will collapse with them. And that's what the people who gested them wanted that. So we are advocating on this, open the door more, whereby these people must be treated as a human. You could appreciate now East African refugees now, human rights defenders, when they come here, they cannot enjoy the freedom of movement the way other East Africans enjoy. So we are saying lift all that and right to have a travel document to be acknowledged, what do you call it, a conventional travel document issued by the Office of the Prime Minister and the UNHCR. They have an entitlement to attend meetings, to research, to study, to move out and in the country as like normal people. That's a fundamental right. So fundamentally, that's where this report addresses. And the other report is extractive industries. It's conducted by our national coalition So Robert can highlight, but it talks about more on the challenges associated with frontline human rights activists. Both of them now are speaking, women and also grassroots people, trying to protect the rights, the land rights and the resource rights of their communities.
Before Robert speaks about it, I just wanted you to also speak to how much in terms of advocacy are you now carrying out to make sure that the freedom for movement for rights defenders is enshrined and
exactly.
guaranteed?
We will be, for us, we engage, we have engagement processes with the, what do you call it, duty bearers. And every year we conduct what we call stakeholder meeting, where the UNHCR, Office of the Prime Minister, police, anybody who deals with refugee human rights defenders, we bring them together, and the NGOs even who are concerned on that. And then the dialogue is being established from there. So now, in this COVID time, the dialogue will be on Zoom or maybe physical next year, early on that. So this report, which has been launched, addresses measurable and reachable, attainable, recommendations to all the sectors which is concerned, including the government of Uganda, the UNHCR, the donors, people who issue also visas here, the embassies, to treat the human rights activists as a normal citizens refugee, as a normal citizens who can go attend a meeting in Geneva and come back to do their other things in the country which hosts them. So that's, I think, and we are making elaborate advocacy on that. If you go to our social media, it has been really discussed, and they were discussing to also articulate it, but we continue to campaign those measures to attain by holding meetings of stakeholders.
All right. Robert, if you speak to silencing the defenders, the report that you just recently released.
The discovery of oil in the Albertine region has come with the good, the bad, and the ugly. In terms of challenges, human rights defenders working in the extractives in those regions where oil has been discovered and in mining areas in Karamoja region have been facing many challenges, and that's what the study is all about. In terms of transparency, that when they seek for information or they try to make a case for project-affected persons, these are people who have been, who are supposed to be compensated for loss of land, because that's where the projects are situated, not being compensated adequately and on time. So when human rights defenders come out to speak about these issues, the reprisals they get from state actors is one of the major challenges. And how do these reprisals manifest themselves? One, intimidation. Intimidation by saying we're going to arrest you, we're going to close you down, you cannot participate in radio talk shows because the RDCs will have warned the radio that please, if you host that person, your license is going to be cancelled. Three, including the banks being asked to freeze the accounts of these NGOs that are doing this kind of important work. And therefore, the working environment becomes very hostile for human rights defenders. The level of intimidation, the arrests and torture they are subjected to is insurmountable. And therefore, you find that all they have to do is to sort of censor themselves, that there's some things that will not be able to talk, because including development partners tend to shy away from you, because the mere fact that the state actors are now blacklisting you, they don't want anyone to be dealing with you. Human rights defenders working on the environment actually are facing it as rough as human rights defenders working in the areas of freedom of expression, such as journalists. So they face enormous challenges. And we're trying to educate state actors through that report, because we intend to use it as an advocacy tool. And you recognize that we've so far tried to advocate for a law. The Human Rights Defenders Bill of 2020 was prepared by a private member's motion, and we are trying to see how we can have a law that recognizes and legitimizes the work of human rights defenders in terms of operationalizing Article 38 of the Constitution. So it is yet to be gazetted, I think, and then we'll see how we move from there. But the challenges are enormous. We really need to educate these state actors, the contribution of human rights defenders to the national development of this country, if they are to acquire the national priorities as stipulated in the National Development Plan 3.
All right, thank you so much. Brenda, if you could make your very concluding remarks, what message would you send to other human rights defenders in solidarity? But also, what message would you send to state actors, many of them who watch these TV platforms?
Okay, I think for me, I'm calling upon everyone out there, the public, policymakers, women, men, and everyone. Please allow your women, your wives, your daughters, your sisters to participate in promoting human rights. Let them use their talents to contribute to our society. But then also, I really want to thank, in particular, women human rights defenders out there that have refused to be intimidated, that they have reported cases of sexual violence against them when they are holding peaceful protests. Women human rights defenders who have refused to accept smear campaigns, and they are really taking on the courage to promote human rights. I think we all need to recognize the important work of women human rights defenders, learn from their experiences, and then support their cause.
All right. Robert, your final message of solidarity with human rights defenders.
First of all, to appreciate the work that human rights defenders, especially grassroots human rights defenders, they face enormous challenge in comparison to us who are mainly urban-based human rights defenders. And to assure them the continuous support and that will be cushioned to them by the National Coalition of Human Rights, because that's our mandate basically, to ensure that we provide them protection, that we advocate for a safe and secure environment as they do their work, and also to always provide them the emergency support when they are under threat or attack. So our appeal also goes to state actors, not to see us as enemies of the state, not to consider us as negative forces, but to see us as partners who are complementing the state in achieving its national priorities as defined in the National Development Plan 3.
Thank you so much. Hassan, your final message of
my
solidarity?
final message of solidarity is that Defend Defenders was established in 2005. We are celebrating now 15 years. First of all, to thank the government and the people of Uganda for the hospitality and hosting us here and giving us, a lesson to operate, and also collaborating in any way which Defend Defenders request. As Robert said, we also contributors, but I don't want to go to that side. Our mandate also include establishing robust national coalition for human rights defenders in each and every country in the continent. I'm so happy now. Robert and his team, who are secretariat, have now come a long way and now carrying the mantle of protection, advocacy, and capacity building of their own members. Defend Defenders, we are a regional organization. We don't claim that we know the gritty-nitty things of protection issues in Karamajong, other place. But the national coalition have their own members, which we are gathering now here, to reach out. We supplemented them, we complemented them, we actively raise their voices where they cannot reach them, but we let them do. Similarly, this initiative of women human rights defenders, it's an issue now. I'm glad that now East Africa now, each and every country is coming also with their chapters. And Uganda is a lead. Brenda already, her team, is one of the leads who first made women human rights defenders, coalitions in the continent. So I congratulate them, I celebrate with them, and I'm saying that, despite the challenges of all these things, including the COVID, activists have established resilience of work to help their communities. So they really need to be applauded.
All right. Thank you so much, Hassan. Thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us today. It's been an interesting conversation on defending the rights of the defenders. And of course, today is the day they celebrate the rights of the defenders. But tomorrow is the actual International Human Rights Day. And you can join those celebrations as NTV. Of course, we also have journalists. We also, by the way, I must add, we are also part of the defenders of rights. And of course, this is a conversation that engulfs us as much. But thank you so much for joining us. And now we'll continue with our programming on NTV.